Today's episode sponsored by our friends over at Surfshark. Look, a VPN doesn't just hide your IP address, it helps you disappear from the noise. Trackers, ads, data collectors, all of it. Surfshark keeps your browsing private, secure, encrypted, so people don't know what you're doing online. Even your internet service provider, they can spy on you. It's really weird. They can see that information, but with Surfshark, they can't because of that encrypted connection. It also blocks trackers and malware by default, and features like Clean Web help cut down the amount of junk that follows you around online. You can even route your traffic through multiple countries at once with multi-hop, which makes you even harder to trace. Extra privacy, extra security, and the best part, one account covers all of your devices with no limits. I mean, we've all got loads of devices these days. Plus, family as well. So that's fantastic, all for one price. Go to surfshark.com/ITS or use the code ITS at checkout and you'll get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN totally for free. And now back to today's episode. We've all been there. Maybe your significant other wouldn't stop snoring no matter how many times you elbow them in the ribs, hit them with your pillow, or spent an entire week fuming without actually addressing the issue. Or perhaps your next door neighbor simply wouldn't stop starting their obnoxiously loud motorcycle an hour before their 5 a.m. departure for work. Whatever the reason, you gave into your base desire for a brief moment, and now you find yourself the proud owner of a dead body. We've all been there, have we? Dave, who wrote today's script, have we? In that strange moment of clarity before panic sets in, you wonder how you'll possibly get away with this. After all, in the movies, characters dispose of bodies and elude the consequences of murder all the time. Surely you could do the same. But which of Hollywood's myriad methods should you use? I mean, you only get one shot at this, don't you? Let's examine a few methods, some with real-life applications, and assess their effectiveness. But don't use these in real-life applications. What the hell, Dave? Burial at sea. Depending on your location, you might consider disposing of your incriminating cadaver in the ocean. After all, the ocean is real big. What are the chances that someone will unexpectedly come across a dead body before it gets devoured by a shark or something else? If you ever choose to use this method, there are several factors you should consider. First of all, tides. It might be tempting to check when the tide is next going out in the dead of night and simply push your newly acquired corpse off the end of a pier, confident that the ocean will do the heavy lifting for you. However, this approach, it'll almost certainly fail. Although the body may initially sink, gases will build up in the torso after a few hours underwater, causing it to float back to the surface. Additionally, the tide won't carry it far enough, meaning that it will likely wash back onto the shore by morning. So, what can you do? If you've got access to your own boat or don't mind stealing one, your best bet is to travel several miles offshore as discreetly as possible before ditching your cargo. Moreover, cutting a large hole in the abdomen will prevent the body from resurfacing. Oh my god. If you're not up for that, attaching some nice heavy weights should also do the trick. A word of caution though, in your haste to sneak out to sea under the cover of darkness, don't forget to check whether your chosen burial site is close to a prominent fishing trawler route. It would be both inconvenient and embarrassing to have your victim resurface 2 hours later as part of the latest catch. And when you're looking up those trawling routes, you better use a VPN like today. No, I'm not gonna do a VPN sponsorship right now. Now that we've covered the logistics, let's examine how effective this method has been historically. Of course, any analysis of its effectiveness is inherently flawed. If this method has ever truly worked, we wouldn't have any records of it, but we can at least look at cases where it didn't go as planned. Elizabeth Plunkett, the first victim of serial killers John Shaw and Jeffrey Evans. Elizabeth Plunkett was 23 and currency clerk residing at Pembroke Cottages in Ringsend in Dublin. In 1976, after enduring a harrowing ordeal that lasted several days and involved multiple beatings and sexual assaults, she was strangled and her body was disposed of by being thrown from a rowing boat some distance out in British Bay. Although Shaw and Evans took the precaution of travelling far out to sea and even attached a lawnmower to the body for ballast, Plunkett was still returned by the sea within just a few days, washing up less than a mile from where the two had left her. As it turned out, the killers were so fundamentally inept at covering their tracks that convictions could almost certainly have been secured even without the body. Nonetheless, its return provided the victim's family with a measure of closure. The case demonstrates that even if all the precautions mentioned above are taken, disposing of a body near the shore can still prove problematic. Now, let's examine a case where the disposal was 100% effective, even if it didn't result in the perpetrator evading justice. When his marriage began to unravel, Thomas J. Capano, a successful Delaware lawyer who ran his own construction business, followed a familiar path and embarked on a secret affair. His new interest, Anne Marie Fahey, an aide to Congressman Carper, was initially a willing participant. However, she soon described him, in her own words, as a controlling, manipulative, insecure, jealous maniac. 3 years into their affair, Fahey mysteriously vanished, and Capano quickly became the prime suspect, especially after it emerged that he was the last person seen with her. Following an extensive FBI investigation, evidence revealed that Thomas had indeed murdered Fahey and, with the assistance of his brother Gerard, disposed of her body at sea. The following summary of events is taken from the FBI's website. After Tom murdered Fahey, he forced her body into a large fishing cooler he had purchased about 2 months earlier. On June 28th, Tom and Jerry Capano drove Jerry's boat approximately 70 miles off the New Jersey coast and dumped the cooler in the Atlantic Ocean. When the cooler wouldn't sink, Jerry used a shotgun he kept on board for shark fishing to shoot it full of holes. Even then, the cooler remained afloat. Tom then removed Fahey's body from the cooler, wrapped it in 2 anchors, threw it overboard, and watched it descend. Afterwards, he tossed the cooler back into the water. Had Gerard not been arrested on separate drug and firearm charges and subsequently agreed to testify against his brother, it is entirely possible that Thomas J. Capano would have successfully gotten away with murder. After all, as of this writing, Anne Marie Fahey's body has never been found. So, using this case as a guide, we can say that, at least theoretically, disposal at sea has the potential to be an extremely effective method. That being said, unless you have access to a boat capable of traveling a considerable distance offshore, there are likely easier methods. General abandonment. Although simply dragging the deceased into some bushes and running away might seem like the worst idea, perhaps second only to leaving them where they fell, it is, in some places at least, the most frequently adopted tactic. According to an article in Forensic Science International titled "Where Are Homicide Victims Disposed?", a study of all Queensland reported homicides between 2004 and 2020 reveals the following. 1. The offender's vehicle was the most common method of transporting the victim, followed by carrying or dragging. 2. Concealment was most often achieved using leaf litter and local debris, with some cases showing no attempt at concealment at all. 3. After transport, victims were moved less than 50 meters away from a road or track. Before examining the effectiveness of this method, let us briefly consider why so many people make so little effort to conceal the evidence. At first glance, the idea that this method might actually work appears ludicrous, yet with a bit more thought, it begins to make sense. Most people who commit murders are not cold, calculating serial killers who spend hundreds of hours planning the perfect crime. More often than not, the act is carried out on the spur of the moment, leaving little time for creative planning. If we consider that this method is by far the most popular among caught murderers, it's not a huge stretch to assume that it is also the most ineffective. But are there any cases in which someone committed a murder, dragged the body into the woods, covered it with leaves, and that was enough to keep it undiscovered? Well, we don't know. As mentioned earlier, if it worked, the perpetrator would have gotten away with it, leaving us with no information to analyze. What we need, much like in the previous century, is a case where someone was convicted of murder and even confessed to the crime, yet for whatever reason the body was never found. After all, there are certainly parts of this planet where an unattended corpse is swiftly cleared away by local wildlife. In the UK, however, a body might remain for many years because there aren't any scavengers capable of consuming an entire human. Try it in Asia, the Middle East, or anywhere else where hyenas roam, and you might have more success. On or around August 13th, 2010, Stephen Pike, who had recently discovered that his mother, Sulin, had altered her will to name him as the sole beneficiary, murdered her. He then disposed of her body in the bushland on Australia's Gold Coast. Despite clinging to the popular delusion that if there's no body, there can be no conviction, Pike was eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. The evidence used to secure the conviction included, but was not limited to, the following. Motive, as previously mentioned, his mother had recently altered her will so that he would inherit 100% of her estate. He also repeatedly misled the police regarding his whereabouts on specific days, what he was doing at those times, and where his mother had gone. Also, on or around the date of the murder, Stephen purchased a shovel, 2 drop sheets, and industrial-strength cleaner. He also conducted several Google searches for locations within the local bushland, and his car was later recovered from a secluded, wooded area less than 30 meters from where his mother's charred belongings would eventually be found. Although it has been accepted that he dismembered the corpse and buried it under leaves in that same area, extensive searching of the vicinity has, so far, yielded no results. It's perhaps most likely that either the local wildlife feasted on the remains or that the area is simply too big to search with any real degree of accuracy. Either way, this case does prove that very occasionally, simply abandoning the body in a nearby woods can be an effective method, although it is important to cover your tracks much more carefully than Stephen Pike did. Animals. Although we briefly touched on animals in the last entry, their involvement in the body disposal process was largely a matter of chance. Sure, if you dump your unwanted corpse out in the wild somewhere, there is a chance that it will be consumed by the local wildlife. However, as mentioned earlier, the likelihood of this happening varies greatly depending on geographical location. If you want to be absolutely sure of a successful vanishing, you must do things properly, and the key element here is selecting the correct animal for the job. If this were a movie, you might simply toss the remains into a tank of piranhas and call it a day. However, in real life, this approach presents several issues. First and foremost, very few people have access to a large tank full of piranhas, and even if they did, they would likely be disappointed by the fish's general ineffectiveness at, shall we say, cleaning up after an accident. In reality, the classic feeding frenzy depicted in films when any living creature comes into proximity of these fish is largely a myth, and if not an invention of Hollywood, then it's certainly enforced by it. Only certain subsections of this species are genuinely attracted to the scent of blood, and they usually prey only on creatures that are roughly the same size as themselves. So, what's your alternative? What species of animal is not only widely available in many countries around the world, but also has a reputation for eating just about anything? And, of course, we're talking about the humble pig. Much like the popular notion involving piranhas, there is a persistent legend that pigs could be used to completely erase all evidence in a murder case, a theme that has been at the heart of many legends, books, and movies. However, until recently, no actual research had been conducted to test this idea. That was until 2020. According to an article on the website of the National Center for Biotechnology Information, researchers set about to determine whether pigs would actually consume an entire body, and if so, how much of that body would remain recognizable after the digestion process. To test this theory, domestic pigs were fed kangaroo carcasses along with 90 human teeth. The results were, at least for anyone hoping to use pigs to dispose of a body, quite intriguing. Quote, biological traces including bones, bone fragments, teeth, and tooth fragments were recovered both post-digestion from pig feces and uneaten from the porcine enclosure. Of the human teeth recovered during the study, 29% were found. Among these, 35% were retrieved post-digestion from the feces, while 65% were recovered uneaten from the enclosure. Of the recovered human teeth, 81% were deemed suitable for identification by a forensic odontologist. From the 447 bones recovered from the enclosure, 94% could be identified to a specific bone type and species. In contrast, none of the 3,338 bone fragments recovered from the pig feces retained morphological traits that could provide further intelligence. Overall, the study found that pigs will feed on human analogs and will consume soft tissue, bones, and human teeth. And armed with this information, we can start to make a plan. Although teeth that have passed through a pig may still be recognizable and identifiable, the rest of the matter extracted from the feces is degraded to such a degree that little more than the species can be determined. So, assuming you get rid of the teeth, and a mouthful of teeth is much simpler to eliminate than the person they came from, then, at least theoretically, pigs might be the way to go. But here's the most important question. Are there any examples where this approach has been used effectively in the real world? Well, depending on who you trust, yeah, possibly. Enter Robert William Picton. Picton, a pig farmer from Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, is alleged to have killed nearly 50 people, although he was only ever convicted of 6 murders. Not only is it highly probable that he fed many of the remains to his pigs, part of the reason he could only be charged with 6 murders, but there's also substantial evidence that he ground up the remains of more than one of his victims and mixed them with pork before selling the resulting mixture to locals. Perhaps not quite what people immediately envision when considering body disposal, feeding it to animals, but it can be surprisingly effective. So where does that leave us regarding the effectiveness of using animals to dispose of a homemade dead person? Well, based on the limited but reliable information available, this option appears to be quite good. Of course, it depends on where you are in the world and the types of animals accessible to you. However, if you happen to have access to a small group of pigs in a secluded area, this might be the best option that we've discussed so far. Yeah, you must remove the teeth before feeding time, but hiding a bag of teeth, as mentioned a few minutes ago, is a lot easier than concealing a whole body. As long as you plan the rest of the act carefully, clean up afterward, and most importantly, don't document your crimes, you might just get away with it if you feed the evidence to the pigs. Thanks for watching, you psycho.